Good afternoon, all. For those who may not know me, my name is Neil Campbell, and I'm the Florida DOT State Noise Technical Lead from the Environmental Management Office in Tallahassee. I'd like to welcome you all to the methodology to evaluate of highway traffic noise at special land uses presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on our noise website afterwards. Also, a PDF copy of the presentation slides will also be available per your request. Please send your request to either Catherine Bradley or myself. Also, OEM will send out the PDH certificates afterwards. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions in the question tab. It's in your upper right-hand corner of your screen. And Catherine and I will categorize that and provide those questions to the speaker at the end of the presentation. At this time, I'd like to hand it over to Siobhan, and she will give you a couple more updates as well.
Thank you, Neil. Yes, just a quick walkthrough for those of you not familiar with GoTo. It got a bit of a facelift, so we'll just walk through your controls really quickly. As Neil mentioned, for any questions for the team as we go through the subject matter today, you're going to go to the upper right corner if you're on a desktop, and you'll see the text box at the bottom right. So you submit that, it'll go to the team, and if they're not, they'll try to answer it today, or as Neil mentioned, they will follow up afterwards. And then if you are on a phone or a tablet, you will also be looking for that question mark. But in general, look to the top right of your screen. And of course, if you are having trouble hearing something or having any other issues, you're welcome to put that in the questions pane as well, and we will try our best to help you. Any further issues, we suggest going to support.goto.com to get additional technical issues solved. So with that, Christina.
I'll go ahead and introduce our presenter. I've had the pleasure of working with our presenter since I came on board FDOT and the noise test team in April of 2022. She has been on the noise tax team since the end of 2020, and she has provided highway traffic noise support to FDOT, including assisting in developing methodologies, updating regular guidance documents, as well as assisting in facilitating the OEM noise task team and developing highway traffic noise training. Christina is a senior planner at Akin Realis for over 6 years, and she has been performing noise evaluations for over 10 years and has been in the environmental field for over 15 years. Christina worked for the state of Florida at the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, as well as other environmental consulting firms. At Akin Realis, she is responsible for managing and performing highway traffic noise evaluations for various Florida departments for our Florida Department of Transportation offices, as well as several other states such as Texas, Michigan, Nevada, Colorado, North and South Carolina, as well as Georgia, to name a few. So at this time, it's my pleasure to turn the rest of the presentation time over to our speaker and presenter, Christina.
Thank you, Neil. All right, first up, we're going to have a little fun doing a Mentimeter poll. So if you guys could log on to menti.com and type in the code shown on your screen here. And we will go ahead and get started. So our first question here is just really kind of getting a feel for what state you're located in. We're going to have a couple of fun questions to kind of capture you guys as a virtual attendee. We don't get to bump elbows physically right now because this is a virtual presentation. So we're going to have some fun with a poll first. Lots of Florida people. Alabama, Ohio, Tennessee, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Wow. All right. Looks like the responses have started to trickle in here. Oh, got a few more. All right. Next question here. Describe your experience with evaluating highway traffic noise. And this should range from everything from your first exposure to noises today, all the way up through you could complete a noise analysis with no supervision and everything in between. All right. All right, our next question here. What is your affiliation? So we have everything from Florida DOT, non-Florida DOT, Florida consultants, non-Florida consultants, federal agencies, state agencies other than DOTs, and of course, other. All right, so majority of us are Florida consultants and Florida DOT. A few trickling in here. All right, and next question here. Have you used the new special land use methodology? It was published at the beginning of this year, end of last year, technically. So we're going on about a year that it's been available for use. And it was made hard-coded into the PD&E manual with this recent update of the PD&E manual a few months ago. For those of you guys who have answered yes for a project, we encourage you guys to submit comments, questions, concerns, etc. in using the methodology. We're always open-eared for feedback. All right. I think that was our last question for the day for our polls. We will be having some quizzes halfway through and at the end of the presentation. Don't worry, we're not going to hold your feet to the fire, but it's just a friendly competition to get you guys more engaged. So, all right, so let's go ahead and jump into the actual presentation here. So this is FDOT's Office of Environmental Management's presentation on the revised methodology to evaluate highway traffic noise at special land uses, or in other words, non-residential areas. So this presentation will cover the basics of evaluating highway traffic noise at special land uses, why the methodology was recently updated, and provides an overview of the new methodology. The new methodology includes a 7-step process, which includes identifying impacts, the preliminary screening, optimizing the barrier, determining cost effectiveness, the engineering review, any public involvement that should occur, and of course, last but not least, documentation. And as mentioned earlier, if you have a question during the presentation, please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel, and we will be addressing questions at the end of the presentation. So a special land use is abbreviated as SLU. So if you hear that term, that's what we are referring to. The special land use guidance document and worksheet that have been produced in support of this methodology are actually available on the FDOT website, as documented on the screen here. And this presentation follows the outline of the guidance document that's available, beginning with the introduction of the original 1997 methodology and how it was updated in 2009, and also details the new 7-step methodology. The document can be found in the Office of Environmental Management's Documents and Resources website under Guides and Handbooks. And that's a screenshot of it on the side of the screen right there. So an important update to note, as some of you may be aware, 23 CFR 772, FHWA's Title 23 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 772, is in the process of being updated. They released a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on October 18th of 2024, which includes several proposed changes. The FHWA is accepting comments on these proposed changes through December 17th of 2024. This methodology to evaluate special land uses will be updated to follow the new 23 CFR 772 once that final rule has been published. So let's move on to Lesson 1, Introduction to Special Land Use Evaluations. So we'll look at what a special land use is, address the limitations of the 97-2009 methodology, and also provide an overview of the updated special land use methodology. So special land uses are non-residential land uses that are listed in Title 23, Part 772 of the Code of Federal Regulations. They include land uses such as parks, schools, places of worship, medical facilities, cemeteries, hotels, restaurants, and compose activity categories A, C, D, and E. Activity category B is considered residential. So the table on the right of this screen shows Table 1 to Part 772 and lists several types of land uses alongside their noise abatement criteria, or the noise levels at which impacts are identified. Noise barriers are evaluated if noise levels are predicted to meet or exceed these decibel criteria listed in the table. The criteria are referred to as the Noise Abatement Criteria, or NAC, N-A-C, and the evaluation locations for special land uses can include both interior as well as exterior areas for some, but not all, land use types. So up until 2024, special land uses were evaluated using a methodology outlined in the 2009 document titled A Method to Determine Reasonableness and Feasibility of Noise Abatement at Special Land Use Locations. Importantly, this updated methodology we're discussing today replaces the methodology last published in 2009. The methodology was updated for several reasons. First and foremost, there was an update to Title 23, Part 772 of the Code of Federal Regulations that occurred in 2010, which was right after the 2009 update. Specifically, the noise abatement criteria were changed so that the land uses and their respective decibel thresholds were recategorized, and additional exterior land use criteria and types were added. Second, the methodologies for evaluating special land uses and residences were independent and included separate metrics that could not be combined. And as a result, there was no uniform way of evaluating a noise barrier for adjacent impacted special land uses and residences together. Additionally, a noise evaluation can be a lengthy process, and over the years, it's been found that smaller special land uses are often ineligible for noise abatement in the form of a noise barrier due to the difficulty in meeting usage criteria. The 2009 methodology did not allow for a preliminary screening of these low usage special land uses before a full evaluation took place. There was also a lack of guidance on how to address the application of the noise reduction design goal, which is an acoustic requirement for abatement to be recommended. The 2009 guidance document didn't provide guidance on how to specifically apply that 7 decibel reduction. And finally, there were no example tables or table templates. So as a result, noise reports were inconsistently presenting various information about the noise barrier evaluations associated with those special land uses. So this updated methodology addresses these by accounting for the change in the NAC in 2010, establishing the development of a methodology which allows for the combined evaluation of noise barriers for both adjacent impacted residences as well as non-residential land uses, by providing a preliminary screening which reduces the level of time and effort for evaluating noise abatement for isolated low usage special land uses, providing specific guidance on how to apply the noise reduction design goal, and of course by providing an example of a noise barrier evaluation table for a special land use that could be provided in a noise report. So let's move on to lesson 2, the development of the new methodology. To evaluate special land uses, 23 CFR 772 states that each highway agency shall adopt a standard practice for analyzing these land use facilities that is consistent and uniformly applied statewide. So as a result, each state has a different way of evaluating them. In developing the new methodology, it was important to identify how different states around the country approach noise abatement for special land uses. Therefore, each state's methodology for evaluating them was researched and categorized. The research revealed that many states use an equivalent residential value type methodology, and in this type of methodology, a special land use is weighted to reflect its residential equivalent. This methodology allows for both residential and special land use impacts to be evaluated together by creating a common denominator of a residential value. The composite number of equivalent receptors can then be used to determine reasonableness of a single noise barrier serving the combined residential and non-residential land uses. Some states also incorporate a linear footage or acreage of the special land use to equate to a residential value. Similar to Florida, many states also incorporate person usage or person hour usage of a special land use, which can be important for identifying the cost effectiveness. Some states also have a simple methodology where a special land use is equated to a single residence. Although this methodology allows for the combined analysis of residences and non-residential uses to be combined, the methodology kind of makes it nearly impossible for noise abatement to be found reasonable and feasible for a special land use, no matter how large or widely used the special land use is, unless there's also adjacent impacted residences. And some states actually don't have publicly available information which explains how to evaluate highway traffic noise for special land uses specifically. So to assist with categorizing each state's methodology, a matrix was compiled. So as you can see from the table, and as mentioned in the previous slide, many states have a specific methodology that is applied to special land uses. A few states have no public information available, and in the research it was noted whether the state had a specific guidance document developed, whether a special land use methodology was specified in an overall handbook, perhaps only a few sentences, whether a single or multiple or equivalent receptor methodology was used, if a grid of receptors was used for areas, if the methodology considered person usage, or if it considered a linear frontage or square footage of the special land use. As shown in the matrix, some states equate a special land use to a single residence, as mentioned, where the single receptor is identified for the special land use, while many other states actually utilize an equivalent receptor type methodology, where that special land use is equated to a residential value based on hours of usage or other metric to provide proper weight to the special land use. As mentioned earlier, some states also consider the linear frontage or acreage of the special land use when determining the residential weight. So let's move on to lesson 3, the methodology overview. As previously mentioned, the methodology to evaluate special land uses can be broken down into 7 different steps. Step 1 is to identify the impacts using the Federal Highway Administration's Traffic Noise Model, or TNM. Step 2 is to perform the preliminary screening at isolated special land uses to determine if usage at the special land use is so unreasonably low that a noise barrier would not be feasible or reasonable under these reasonable conservative assumptions. Step 3 is to perform the barrier evaluation, including optimization. Step 4 is to determine the cost effectiveness of the barrier. Step 5 is for the post-NEPA phase only, is to perform an engineering review. Step 6, also mainly performed post-NEPA, is to perform any public involvement activities such as surveys or events. And of course, finally, step 7 is to document the findings of the analysis. Shown here is a more detailed flow chart of the 7-step process. It can also be found in the Special Land Use Methodology Guidance document, which is available on the FDOT OEM website, as mentioned previously. This flow chart can be used to guide the noise analyst in decision-making through the special land use noise evaluation process. And we'll go over each step of this flow chart in detail. So let's take a closer look at step 1, identifying impacts. So starting at the top of the flowchart here, we see step 1, which is to identify the impacts. In order to determine impacts, the Federal Highway Administration's Traffic Noise Model, or TNM for short, should be used to predict noise levels. The evaluation should follow the procedures listed in Title 23 CFR Part 772, and of course the latest version of the FDOT PD&E Manual, Chapter 18, Highway Traffic Noise. Impacts are identified based on the criteria set by 23 CFR Part 772 for each land use type. If impacts are identified at a special land use, the noise analyst should coordinate with the FDOT district noise specialist and notify them of the impacted special land use and intent to evaluate noise abatement. To evaluate noise levels, representative locations are chosen to be modeled using FHWA's TNM. These representative locations are called receptors. Receptors should be placed at areas of frequent human use as required by 23 CFR 772 and also described in Part 2, Chapter 18 of the PD&E manual. Receptors should not be placed at areas which are not considered frequently used. There are three main types of receptor placements for exterior areas of frequent human use at special land uses. Note that a special land use may have more than one receptor placement type if multiple types of special land use usages are present at the special land use. For example, a park with a playground and a trail and perhaps a large sports field. These three types of receptor placements are a single receptor, a grid of receptors, and a linear trail of receptors. And each of these types of receptor placements are illustrated in the last column shown on the table here. Due to the various types of special land use locations, any questions regarding the application of this methodology should be directed to the FDOT District Noise Specialist. So if you're having trouble determining which type of receptor placements you should use, go ahead and contact the FDOT District Noise Specialist. Of course, documentation of any decisions and rationale should be provided in the noise study report. Now let's take a closer look at each type of receptor placement. For a concentrated activity, such as restaurants, bars, basketball courts, swimming pools, or small playgrounds, a single receptor might be used to identify impacts. Receptors should be placed at the closest location to the highway right-of-way line, or where impacts are most likely to exist, and where outdoor activity normally occurs. For most concentrated activities, a single receptor is sufficient to identify impacts. However, sometimes more than one receptor might be needed to fully assess the area of frequent human use if it's determined to be impacted. Furthermore, the noise barrier or optimization process needs to be able to fully identify the entire area of benefit. For interior areas, receptors should be placed at an interior point that would be a site of frequent human use, such as a stage, a seating area, etc., following the FDOT Traffic Noise Modeling and Analysis Practitioner's Handbook. Or it can be placed at the corner of the facade of the building closest to the facility. Typically, only one receptor is sufficient for modeling interior NACD land uses. However, it might be deemed necessary to evaluate more than one receptor at an interior location based on professional judgment. Now let's look at dispersed passive use. For dispersed passive use, such as a golf course or a park where use is spread out through a large portion of land, a grid format should be utilized. The grid spacing depends on the acreage of the special land use area being evaluated and is discussed in more detail on the next slide. For golf courses specifically, receptors should be placed at tee boxes and greens. And then for sports fields and arenas, they should have receptors placed at bleachers and stands and active playing fields. So here is an example of a grid format that was used to evaluate a school's exterior area of frequent human use. The school has a track, a football field, baseball field, a softball field, and other areas of exterior frequent human use. And as shown, receptors were placed in all exterior areas of frequent human use, including the playing fields, the onlooker stands, etc. And this example reflects grid spacing every 50 feet. In creating the grid, the noise analyst should create a grid of receptors that covers both the entire area of impact and the suspected area that would be provided a benefit, or in other words, a noise reduction of 5 decibels, by the noise barrier. The spacing and number of grid receptors will vary based on the acreage of the special land use area being evaluated. The table on this slide provides the recommended spacing of receptors in a grid format and is also, of course, found in the guidance document. It's important to note that only the area being evaluated for impacts or benefits should be considered for the acreage in this table. In other words, the entire property or parcel does not have to be gridded. For example, you would not put a grid of receptors over the entire Disney park. You would only put receptors in the area that you are evaluating for noise impacts, which is closest to the facility. If impacts are identified, this grid would also be utilized in the barrier optimization process to identify the spatial extent of benefit that the barrier provides. Of course, a balance between the number and density of receptors should be identified so that the grid is detailed enough to support an accurate barrier optimization process, but it does not overwhelm the T&M model with too many receptors. Whether or not the receptor spacing in the table is utilized, the density of receptors should be specified in the noise study report. Let's move on to linear uses. This is the last type of receptor placement that we'll be discussing. For linear uses such as a trail, receptors should be placed in a linear fashion. The first receptor should be placed at the intersection of the right-of-way and the trail, if that's applicable, and then every 50 feet along the trail. An example of this is shown in the graphic shown on the screen. And note that the entirety of the trail might not need to have receptors. Only the portion of the trail which is in proximity to the roadway facility should be evaluated, which very well might extend up to 500 feet from the right-of-way. Importantly, portions of the trail that are found within the right-of-way, shown as the yellow line in the graphic, do not need to be evaluated. And as a hint, remember that for later. Receptors which represent single special land use properties should be identified by the numerical ID which represents the special land use, followed by a dash and a second unique numerical identifier for each receptor representing the special land use. For example, 15-1, 15-2, 15-3, etc. This nomenclature is different and distinct from receptors representing multi-story residences, which use an alphabetical identifier after the numerical identifier, such as 15A, 15B, 15C, etc. Let's move on to discussing the preliminary screening, or step 2. Step 2 is to perform a preliminary screening. Evaluating a noise barrier for a special land use can be a lengthy and involved process. Therefore, a preliminary screening may be performed to eliminate special land uses which do not have enough usage or person hours of use to justify the cost of a noise barrier, or to eliminate barriers for property owners that do not desire a noise barrier, which is mainly for design phase. Notably, if the special land use does not go through a preliminary screening analysis as described, the special land use must be fully evaluated following the in-depth analysis identified in steps 3 through 7. The screening first asks if the special land use is isolated. An isolated and impacted special land use is an impacted special land use which is located away from other impacted special land uses and impacted residences, such that a single noise barrier would not be a practical form of abatement. If a single noise barrier would be unable to serve as an abatement measure for 2 or more impacted special land uses or residences, they are considered isolated. Coordination with the FDOT district noise specialist may be needed to determine if a special land use is indeed considered isolated. If it is not isolated, and the special land use is nearby other impacted land uses, the noise analyst should proceed to step 3, as the preliminary screening cannot be performed on non-isolated special land uses. If the special land use is isolated, the noise analyst can use the preliminary screening tab in the FDOT special land use worksheet, which is discussed on the next slide, to determine whether or not the isolated special land use meets the usage criteria of having at least around 44,000 person hours of use per year. If the usage criteria is not met, the noise analyst should coordinate with the district noise specialist and refrain from evaluating a barrier, and should of course document the decision process and usage assumptions in the noise study report. If the special land use does have at least 44,000 person hours of use per year, the screening then asks if the project is the PD&E study. If the project is not a PD&E study, the noise analyst should determine if a noise barrier is desired by the property owner of the special land use. If a noise barrier is not desired, do not evaluate the barrier for the special land use. If the project is a PD&E study, you should coordinate with the district noise specialist on potential elimination or proceed to step 3 of the evaluation if desired. If a special land use can achieve the minimum person hours to justify the cost of a noise barrier, a detailed noise barrier analysis should be performed using steps 3 through 7. Otherwise, if a special land use is unable to meet the minimum person hours using reasonable assumptions, documentation should be saved in the project file as well as the noise study report. And of course, coordination with the district noise specialist should also occur to ensure that a full barrier analysis is not needed. So here we see the preliminary screening tab of the FDOT Special Land Use worksheet. This is also available online at the website that was previously mentioned alongside the guidance document. The assumption that 2.53 people utilize the average single-family home in Florida was obtained from the Florida census data from 2018 to 2022. And it is assumed that each single-family home is available for use for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And this decision was based upon the fact that working, sleeping, outdoor activities, etc., can be done at all hours of the day at a residence. To identify the average single-family residence person hours of use per year, the average number of people per residence in Florida, which was 2.53, was multiplied by the hours available for use per year, which is 24 hours times 365 days a year, giving us 8,760 hours. Then 2.53 people was multiplied by the 8,760 hours for a total of 22,163 person hours, which are available for use at a single residence. Because FDOT requires that 2 residences must be provided a benefit for a noise barrier to be considered feasible, noise barriers are not evaluated for any isolated special land use worth less than 2 equivalent residences, or 44,326 person hours per year. The worksheet requires that the special land use property owner be contacted to inquire about usage information. But before reaching out to the property owner, the noise analyst should coordinate with the FDOT district noise specialist to inform them of the intent to contact the property owner. Upon contact, the noise analyst should explain that a noise barrier is being evaluated, but the outcome has not been determined. And after obtaining that usage information, the noise analyst should fill out the usage data in the preliminary screening tab, which is highlighted in yellow in the cells in column N shown on your screen here. The spreadsheet will then automatically calculate if the isolated special land use is equivalent residences and determine if the special land use is eligible for further noise abatement evaluation. If the special land use is determined to not meet the minimum number of person hours of use per day, the noise analyst should coordinate with the district noise specialist and inform them that the special land use was impacted but failed to pass the preliminary screening process. Steps 3 through 5 should not be completed for isolated special land uses which did not meet usage requirements based on the reasonable usage assumptions. Alternatively, if the operational hours of the special land use are known, but usage data is unavailable, the formula shown on the screen can be used to identify the minimum required person hours in the benefited area of a special land use for a noise barrier to be considered cost effective. The formula incorporates the noise barrier height, length, the number of days per week and weeks per year the special land use is operational, and the number of hours per person per day that a visitor might be in the benefited area of that special land use. An important note that the FDOT cost per square foot has recently increased to $40 per square foot, and the cost per benefit has increased to $64,000 per benefited receptors with the recent publication of the 2024 FDOT PD&E manual. The guidance document and the worksheet are actually in the process of being updated to reflect these new criteria and will be made available shortly. If the special land use meets minimum usage requirements and the project is in a post-PD&E phase, such as design or design build, a viewpoint screening should be conducted. So importantly, a viewpoint screening is not performed during a PD&E phase project. This viewpoint screening occurs only after the PD&E phase of the project. And of course, before reaching out to the special land use property owner, the noise analyst should coordinate with the FDOT district noise specialist to inform them of the intent to contact the property owner. And again, upon contact with the property owner, the noise analyst should explain that the noise barrier is being evaluated, but the outcome has, again, not yet been determined. The noise analyst should inquire the property owner's viewpoint for or against a noise barrier evaluation. And if the special land use property owner does desire a noise barrier to be evaluated, usage information should be collected at that time. If the property owner does not desire a noise barrier, you should inform the FDOT district noise specialist of the viewpoint and, of course, document that decision in the noise study report. All right, let's have our first quiz. So if everybody can open up menti.com and plug in your code shown on the screen, we are going to get started with our first friendly quiz competition. All right, looks like we've got a couple people joining here. right, let's go ahead and get started. "46 players are ready." Oop, and counting. All right, 50 players ready. Let's go. Oop. So answer fast to get more points. If a special land use does not pass the preliminary screening test, what should occur? The correct answer is results should be documented in the noise study report. The preliminary screening test is to screen out special land uses that have very low usage. So if they do not pass that screening test, then a full noise barrier evaluation, including optimization, should not happen. You should just document the results in the noise study report for why it did not qualify. Question 2 of 5. What is the suggested naming convention for receptors in a grid format? Aha, correct. 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, etc. All right, question 3 of 5. Do noise levels at a trail located within the FDOT right-of-way need to be evaluated? Got a 50-50 chance on this one. No, FDOT right-of-way, trails that are in the FDOT right-of-way do not need to be evaluated. Question 4. What receptor placements could be used to evaluate a golf course? A grid of receptors, that is correct. That is the best receptor placement for a golf course. All right, last question. The preliminary screening formula can be adjusted to more closely match the parameters of a special land use. True or false? True, yes. That formula we went over can indeed be adjusted to match usage of the special land use. All right, let's see who won. Tom D. Nice job, Tom. All right, let's get back to our presentation. So let's go over the next step. Step 3, the barrier evaluation and optimization. The following steps should be taken to identify the optimal noise barrier length and height for the impacted special land use. First, the noise analyst should create a grid of receptors, if that's applicable, and create the unadjusted noise barrier. Or you can use the previously developed grid from identifying the impacts. Next, the noise analyst should run FHWA's T&M and review the results for benefits from the noise barrier. Then the noise barrier should be optimized for each height. This is typically, here in Florida, it is 8 to 22 feet in height and in 2-foot increments. Optimizing is the process of finding the best barrier configuration that provides a benefit for the impacted receptors, or area of impact in this case. After compiling the noise reduction results for each height evaluated, the noise analyst should coordinate with the district noise specialist to identify the optimal noise barrier height and associated length. The optimization of a noise barrier for special land uses should follow the guidance from FDOT's Traffic Noise Modeling and Analysis Practitioner's Handbook from 2018. A noise barrier is to be input into the T&M model at a length that is considerably greater than what one might anticipate would be needed to maximize the noise reduction. This is referred to as the unadjusted noise barrier length. So a good starting point is to have the barrier extend beyond the end or the last receptor, at least approximately 4 times the perpendicular distance between the receptor and the noise barrier, or what is typically referred to as 4D, 4 times the distance. When optimizing the length of the barrier, only impacted receptors that are benefited should be considered when dropping panels. The optimized noise barrier is required to provide at least a 5 decibel reduction, and at least one receptor must meet the noise reduction design goal, which is a 7 decibel reduction. The goal is for the final noise barrier to benefit the most impacted receptors while achieving the noise reduction design goal of 7 decibels for at least one receptor, and the cost of the barrier is at or below the cost reasonable limit. You might be asking, what does a barrier optimization look like for a grid of receptors? And in this scenario, at least one receptor in the grid must be provided that 7 decibel reduction in order to fulfill the noise reduction design goal. And additionally, in order to fulfill the feasibility requirement that at least 2 impacted residences must be receiving a 5 decibel reduction, the noise barrier would not be considered feasible if the benefited area of the special land use, represented by a single or multiple receptor, is worth less than 2 residences. Let's move on to step 4, determining the cost effectiveness. Step 4 is the process to determine cost effectiveness and reasonableness. Once it's determined that a noise barrier can provide an acoustic benefit to the special land use and meet the noise reduction design goal, the noise analyst should contact the special land use property owner to obtain the usage information in order to calculate cost effectiveness. The noise analyst should be clear to the property owner that an evaluation of noise is being performed and that the determination of a noise barrier is merited. It has not yet been determined. So after obtaining this usage information, the noise analyst should ensure that the usage data is indeed reasonable. If the provided usage data seems unreasonable, the district noise specialist should be consulted. The property owner should provide the operating hours as well as the days per week and weeks per year that the facility is open to the public. They should also provide the number of people and person-hour usage information for the area of the special land use being evaluated. Note that this is not necessarily use of the entire parcel or entire property. Let's go back to the Disney example. You would not input all of Disney's park visitors into this usage table. You would only consider the visitors that are within the area being evaluated. The FDOT special land use worksheet is then compiled using the usage information provided by the property owner. The worksheet then assists the noise analyst to determine if the noise barrier is potentially feasible and reasonable based on that usage information. So it's important to note that all usage information should be reviewed and approved by the FDOT district noise specialist before proceeding with the noise barrier analysis. If the hourly usage per person is not available, or if unreasonable data is provided, the noise analyst should coordinate with the district noise specialist to identify reasonable hourly usage data. Available data should be used to identify reasonable hourly usage, such as the number of parking spots or facility maximum capacities, etc. Importantly, all usage information and assumptions should be documented in the project file and the noise study report. This slide helps to graphically represent the benefited area and receptors and the equivalent residence of those receptors. So to aid with equating a special land use to a residential value, a benefited equivalent residence is calculated, also known as BER. The benefited equivalent residence is the residential weighted value assigned to the benefited area of the special land use based upon person hours of use. In other words, this is the number of residences that the benefited area of the special land use is equivalent to. Remember this term for later, the benefited equivalent residence. So this graphic depicts an example of a grid that was used to evaluate a special land use that is worth 20 residences based on usage information provided by the property owner. The area was evaluated with 8 receptors, making each receptor worth 2.5 residences. The 2 receptors closest to the noise barrier, which is the area shown in green, receive a benefit, or in other words, a 5 decibel reduction as a result of the noise barrier. Therefore, the benefited area of the special land use is worth 5 residences. 2.5 times 2 equals 5. Therefore, the benefited equivalent residence of this special land use is 5. Note that that number can change based on the barrier height and length changing. So as mentioned previously, the FDOT Special Land Use Worksheet, which is pictured here, can be utilized to assist with the assessment of whether a noise barrier is a feasible and reasonable form of abatement. All special land uses which receive a benefit from the noise barrier should have a corresponding special land use tab, shown in green, filled out. The noise analyst should fill out all applicable data and insert the completed noise barrier master table into the noise study report. This tab shown is the instructions tab, showing that the worksheet can be completed by 4 steps. Step 1 is to click on the Noise Barrier Master Table tab. You fill out the yellow highlighted cells, which are project name, FPID, special land use name, special land use descriptions, barrier height and length combinations, etc. And for each height and length evaluated, you should fill out the approximate barrier stationing extent and the number of residences that are provided a benefit, if any, and of course the average and maximum reductions received at any receptor. Step 2, for each special land use evaluated, fill out the yellow highlighted cells in the SLU tabs. This includes the special land use name, description, NAC assigned, the average number of users per day, the approximate hourly usage, the number of days per week and weeks per year the special land use is operational, number of receptors that were evaluated, the number of receptors benefited, and the number of receptors that are both impacted and benefited. Step 3, if a special land use usage is unknown, columns T and U of the noise barrier master table are required to be filled out. They can be used to identify the minimum usage required for the noise barrier to be cost effective. Step 4, once all special land uses have been assigned a tab and all relevant information has been entered in, the noise barrier master table will auto-populate and can be easily copied into the report. Moving on in the special land use worksheet, we have already discussed the preliminary screening tab earlier in the presentation, so we'll go ahead and skip that tab. But moving on to the next tab is the noise barrier master table tab, shown here on the screen. So all yellow highlighted cells shown here should be filled in by the noise analyst. For each height evaluated, typically 8 to 22 feet in 2-foot increments, the noise barrier location, that is whether it's found on the right, along the right-of-way, or along the roadway shoulder, or perhaps on structure, that should be indicated in column D. If a noise barrier system is evaluated, or for example, more than just a single noise barrier, perhaps an overlapping right-of-way barrier and shoulder or structure noise barrier, which accommodates an overpass, the location of each segment and associated length and height should be identified. The barrier height and length should be filled out in columns E and F, respectively. The resulting auto calculation, which is shown in column G, is the cost of the proposed noise barrier using a cost estimate of $40 per square foot. As mentioned previously, this cost is a recent increase, and the special land use methodology is indeed in the process of being updated. The noise barrier's approximate stationing extent should also be filled in column H. The noise analyst should also identify the total number of impacted benefited residences in column I. And benefited residences should be noted in column J. Columns K and L are automatically filled out based on input from the special land use tabs, which will be discussed next. Column M is an auto calculation which adds the total number of impacted benefited residences and impacted BERs. A noise barrier must provide a benefit to at least 2 residences and/or BERs, which is consistent with the FDOT PD&E manual. And if a barrier does not provide a benefit to at least 2 residences and/or BERs, the noise barrier is not considered a feasible form of abatement. Column N is an auto calculation which identifies the total benefited residences and BER to include in the calculation of cost effectiveness. The noise analyst should also identify the average reduction and the maximum reduction that any receptor, residential or special land use, receives from the noise barrier, which is shown in columns O and P, respectively. If the maximum reduction value is at or over 7 decibels, the noise reduction design goal has been met. If the maximum reduction is below 7 decibels, the noise reduction design goal has not been met by the barrier, and the impacted noise sensitive sites do not qualify for a noise barrier. Column Q is an auto calculation of the cost per benefited equivalent residence. This step divides the cost of the proposed noise barrier by the total number of special land use BERs and benefited residences. The worksheet then determines if the cost per benefited residence and/or BER is less than the threshold of $64,000 per benefited receptor. This was recently updated from $42,000. If the cost per benefited residence and/or BER is less than $64,000, the proposed noise barrier is considered cost reasonable. If the cost per benefited residence and/or BER is greater than $64,000, the proposed noise barrier is not considered cost effective, and column R will auto-populate. It will populate as not reasonable. An engineering review is not required. If it is less than $64,000, column R will populate as reasonable. Of note, and as mentioned earlier, there is also a back-end calculation in columns T and U highlighted here. These columns allow for the number of additional BERs and person hours per day that would be required in the benefited area to be cost effective. This aids greatly when usage data for a special land use is not available. Of importance, if a residential area qualifies for a noise barrier on its own merit, and the inclusion of a special land use next to a residential neighborhood would result in the barrier not being feasible or cost effective, the special land use should not be included with the residential noise barrier analysis, and the analysis in coordination with the FDOT district noise specialist should proceed with further evaluating the noise barrier for the residential area. After the yellow highlighted cells shown here have been filled in, the details of each special land use should be entered in the yellow cells of each corresponding special land use tab, which we'll discuss on the next slide. And of course, after completion of the table, the noise barrier master table shown here should be provided in the noise study report. Shown here is a special land use tab. And as mentioned previously, all special land uses which receive a benefit from the noise barrier that's being evaluated should have a corresponding special land use tab filled out. Each special land use tab has built-in calculations and assumptions to equate the special land use area to an equivalent residence, or the total number of residences that the area evaluated the special land use can be equated to based upon hourly usage. This is to facilitate a collective, reasonable cost evaluation which incorporates the usage from residences as well as special land uses. Shown here, step A1 is a built-in calculation which identifies the person hours per year for the average single-family residence in Florida. Again, taking the hours a single-family residence is available for use in a year, which is 24 hours a day, 365 a year, and dividing it by 2.53 people, which is the average number of people in a single-family home in Florida, resulting in 22,163 residential person hours per year available for use in a single-family home. Step A2 requires the input of usage information from the special land use property owner. The special land use property owner may be contacted to inquire about usage information. Before reaching out, as mentioned previously, the noise analyst should coordinate with the FDOT noise specialist to inform them of the intent to contact the property owner. And of course, upon contact, the noise analyst should again explain that a noise barrier is being evaluated, but the outcome has not yet been determined. The noise analyst should fill out usage data in steps A to A through A to D, which is column I of the Special Land Use tab. Step A3 is a built-in calculation for the equivalent residence, which divides the special land use person hours by the residential person hours. Step A4 requires the noise analyst to input the number of receptors evaluated at the special land use, which includes single, gridded, and linear placed receptors. In the barrier evaluation for the special land use, the barrier location, height, and length will be auto-populated from the Noise Barrier Master Table tab. The number of impacted and benefited receptors, which is column F, and the number of benefited receptors, which is column G, should be filled out. The spreadsheet will automatically calculate the special land uses impacted and benefited equivalent residences and benefited equivalent residences in column H and I, respectively. The equivalent residence is calculated by dividing the person hours per year available for use at the special land use by the person hours per year available for use at a residence. The percentage of receptors benefited is also identified to support the calculation of the benefited equivalent residence, or the number of benefited residences that the special land use is worth. And of course, as mentioned previously, each completed special land use tab should be provided in the noise study report. Now let's take a closer look at step 5, the engineering review. Note that an engineering review is typically not performed in the PD&E phase of a project. Therefore, the first task in step 5 is to identify if the project is a PD&E study. If the project is a PD&E study, do not proceed with an engineering review. The engineering review will occur during a later phase of the project. During the subsequent phases of a project, such as design or design build, once an optimal barrier height and length have been chosen, a thorough engineering feasibility review of the barrier should be initiated by the noise analyst. The engineering review ensures that the recommended barrier can be constructed as planned, or if further refinements are necessary before proceeding with the noise barrier. This includes public involvement. This slide shows an example of a noise barrier engineering review form. The noise analyst should fill out the noise barrier details and provide the form to the engineer of record so that they can determine and document engineering constraints. The following concerns should be addressed, including design and constructability, drainage, utility needs, safety requirements, maintenance needs, right-of-way acquisition, legal issues, and of course, any outdoor advertising issues. Additionally, the engineer of record should make a final determination if the noise barrier can be constructed as proposed or if modifications are needed. If modifications are needed, the noise analyst may need to remodel based on the changes needed in order to verify if the noise barrier meets acoustic and cost requirements. The form should then be returned to the noise analyst and provided in the appendix of the noise study report. Now let's take a look at public involvement. Step 6. Public involvement should occur throughout the life cycle of a project. Several public involvement tasks related to a noise barrier are performed, including public hearings, public information meetings, determining the special land use support or opposition to a noise barrier, and identifying the number of users at a special land use by coordinating with the special land use property owner. Of importance, all engineering conflicts must be resolved before a special land use property owner is solicited for their official desire or opposition to a noise barrier using a survey. Public involvement during a PD&E study typically contains two major events: a public workshop, sometimes also referred to as an alternatives public workshop, and a public hearing. At the public workshop, the noise analyst should discuss the noise sensitive sites within the project corridor, and the discussion should include a description of the analysis, procedures, and the potential for traffic noise impacts, utilizing generalized noise contours. At the public hearing for a project, the noise analyst should be prepared to discuss site-specific results of the noise study, including the location of impacted receptors and the potential for further noise abatement consideration during the design phase, if applicable. A draft noise study report should also be available to the public by the time the public hearing occurs. Prior to initiating noise barrier-related public involvement during the design phase, the optimal barrier length and height should be established, and any engineering or constructability issues should be identified and resolved. Noise barrier-specific public involvement includes informational meetings and written surveys to affected property owners and tenants. The following provides examples of the types of written correspondence prepared by the FDOT, which is provided to property owners and tenants in connection with a noise barrier survey. First up is the notification letter. The notification letter alerts the property owners and tenants of the FDOT's intent and also informs them that further information is forthcoming. The letter is mailed using regular or non-certified mail services, and the letters are mailed to the addresses of the property of interest and to the property owner's address if that is different than the property of interest. Property ownership information can be obtained from the property appraiser's office or website for the county in which the project is located. And if a noise barrier specific informational meeting is being held, the date, the time, and the location details are also provided in this letter. Secondly, the noise barrier survey package is put together. This package should include a certified letter from the FDOT describing the roadway improvement project and the noise barriers of interest, an exhibit illustrating the proposed location of any barriers, information regarding the advantages and disadvantages of noise barriers, color and texture options if that's applicable, and of course the noise barrier survey form. The address of the property being surveyed and the registered property owner's names should be shown on this form. It is recommended that each survey be individually numbered for easier tracking once they're returned. As stipulated in the PD&E manual, it is the FDOT's desire to obtain a response for or against a noise barrier from the majority of the benefited property owners and tenants that respond to the survey. To tally votes between residences and special land uses, the number of residential votes that the special land use is equivalent to must be identified. The number of residential votes that a special land use is worth is based upon the benefited equivalent residents of the special land use. The benefited equivalent residents should be rounded up to identify the number of votes that should be assigned to the special land use. For example, a BER of 2.3 should be rounded to 3 residences. This is auto-calculated in column I of each special land use tab in the special land use worksheet as described earlier. It's important to note that the viewpoints of the property owner will be considered as having the greatest weight in the decision as to whether FDOT will provide noise abatement. While the viewpoint of the non-owner residents will be considered, their viewpoint will carry less weight, which is consistent with the formula shown in the table. This table is provided. Last but not least, step 7, documentation, or writing the noise study reports. In the noise study report, the noise barrier types, lengths, and heights evaluated and the evaluation results for each barrier evaluated must be documented in the noise study report. Note that the PD&E phase reports are now referred to as noise study reports, and the subsequent design phase reports are now referred to as design noise study reports. This change was recently made in the PD&E manual update, which eliminated the term noise study report addendum. A table documenting the noise barrier types, heights, lengths, locations, cost, and required minimum person hours for the noise barrier to be considered cost reasonable must be completed and provided in the noise study report. An example table is provided on the next slide. Additionally, all impacted special land uses for which a barrier analysis was performed must have the FDOT Special Land Use Worksheet, Special Land Use tab completed and provided in the noise study report. All impacted special land use for which a barrier was not performed due to the preliminary screening must document the assumptions used and why a noise barrier evaluation was not performed. Shown here is an example table that can be provided in the noise study report. This table lists the barrier scenario ID, the barrier location, that is if it's on the shoulder or on structure or near the right-of-way, the various barrier heights that were evaluated, typically ranging from 8 to 22 feet in height in 2-foot increments. The barrier length that was evaluated. The barrier's total cost. The approximate barrier XY or stationing extent. The total number of residences that are impacted and benefited by the noise barrier, the total number of benefited residences, the number of impacted and benefited equivalent residences, which is for special land uses, the total special land use benefited equivalent residences, the total impacted and benefited residences and equivalent residences, the total benefited residences and equivalent residences, the average decibel reduction, the maximum decibel reduction, which is to identify if the noise reduction design goal has been met, the cost per benefited equivalent residence, and finally, the decision on whether it is possible for the special land use to meet the required minimum person hours. This table may be modified, of course, on a project-by-project basis. However, a table should be provided for all special land uses evaluated for a noise barrier. All right, our second quiz time. If everybody can go back to menti.com and plug in the code, we will get started with our second quiz. All right, let's go ahead and get started. For a special land use, the noise reduction design goal must be correct, met at least one receptor representing the special land use. Next question. What is the BER? Correct, the benefited equivalent residence. Nice job, guys. Question 3. For a noise barrier to be feasible at a special land use, the total BER must be correct, 2 or greater. This is from the FDOT requirement that at least 2 residences must be provided a benefit. Question 4. If a special land use is unable to provide usage information, correct, you should coordinate with the FDOT to identify conservative estimates of usage data. All right, last question. The completed noise barrier engineering review form should be provided in the design noise study report. True or false? True. That engineering review form should indeed be provided in the design noise study report. All right, let's see who won. Nice job, Sladen. All right. At this time, we will begin to take some questions. This concludes the presentation on the new special land use methodology. I hope you enjoyed, and now we will take any questions.
Yeah, Christina, you've been talking for quite a while now. We do have some excellent questions coming in from our attendees. Thank you all for submitting these questions. I'll take a stab at a couple of these, give you a little breather and maybe a quick drink of water, and then turn some of the questions back over to you. One of the first questions from one of our attendees is the department prepared for extra costs associated with additional barriers for SLUs? The ability to combine impacted SLUs with adjacent and impacted residential areas could result in constructing barriers for SLUs that, if evaluated on their own, which has been the methodology for 30 years, wouldn't qualify for a barrier. So in short, the answer is yes. The primary purpose of this new methodology is to provide a fair and equal treatment for all noise receptors, regardless of whether it's a residence or SLU. However, you need to remember that if there's additional construction cost required to construct the noise barrier for the SLU, such as drainage issues or something else that is a constructability constraint, those costs should be added to the cost of the SLU barrier analysis. Great question. Thank you. Next question. Let's see here. If a barrier for a combined Category B and a Category C or E site is not cost reasonable, can this barrier be cost averaged with all C&Es within the project limits per 772.13.K? No, we cannot do cost averaging. FDOT does not currently allow cost averaging. If the barrier in question is part of a noise barrier system benefiting a single location, such as a subdivision or a contiguous impacted area, it may be combined with other barriers within that system, but there is no allowance for cost averaging in FDOT policy. Next question. These are excellent, folks. Thank you so much. Is there a grace period for this new methodology? The new methodology has been written into the 2024 PD&E Manual, Chapter 18, dated July 31st. It's required for use. However, we all know that projects have unique parameters. Projects started at various times, various time of a year, could be 2 years ago. The key is going to be whether the SLU analysis was started prior to that revised chapter being published. But it's important to note, as Christina has mentioned in the presentation a number of times, this is something that would be ideal to speak with and coordinate on with your district noise specialist. Let's see here. Excellent questions, folks. All right, so this one appears to be related to the preliminary barrier screening for SLUs. Does this new methodology still allow for the back-end calculations like we've been able to do with the older methodology? So yes, there is allowance for that, just as there was with the old methodology. But what's important to note with that is that it requires discussion with the district noise specialist, and even more importantly, documentation in the noise study report. Christina, if you're ready, I think I'll send one to you.
Sure.
All right, so this next question says, explain how I can use the back-end calculation table if I don't have the usage data to determine the equivalent residences? I think this question is in relation to actual barrier analysis table with the SLU tab.
Correct, yes. So in that special land use worksheet that you have, the special land use master table tab has that back end calculation. And how these columns work is it takes the noise barrier height and length and all of the other non-usage information, and it plugs it into a formula that identifies what the minimum usage can be or should be in order to meet the criteria. So plugging in all the other information into those columns will make those back-end calculations auto-populate. And this is particularly helpful for number one, if you don't have any usage information at all, or number two, it could be used for if you have a combination, let's say residential and one special land use, or rather two special land uses, and you only have usage information for one of those special land uses. That back-end calculator will give you an idea of how many additional BERs or person hour usage that is required at that second special land use, so that you can kind of get an idea of if it would be achievable or not, especially if you're right on the cusp of being considered reasonable or not. That would perhaps help to qualify the area for the barrier.
Excellent. Thank you, Christina. We've got another question here that says, so we can just call the place, and if they don't want a barrier, we don't have to do any screening or analysis?
So once in the preliminary screening process, if you ask the property owner if they are for or against a barrier, if they are against a barrier, you should coordinate with the district noise specialist. Sometimes it would be, of course, advisable to go ahead and perform the barrier analysis. Other times it would not be necessary. So coordination with the FDOT district noise specialist is required if they do not want a barrier, and that's determined in the preliminary screening.
Excellent. Thank you for that explanation. This next question appears to the person's asking about some grid spacing. And they ask, am I limited to the receptor grid spacing shown in the manual, or can I use a closer spacing if I deem it needed, even though it's for a bigger area?
Absolutely, yes, this is a great question. So the grid spacing in the guidance document is just a recommendation. If you stray from that table, and as we all know, as Jason said earlier, every project is different and has various constraints, you can adjust that grid spacing as needed. If you feel you need more or less, that's totally fine, as long as you can get an accurate picture of how well the barrier performs when you do your barrier optimization, and it's documented in the noise study report what that grid spacing was, then that's good to go. It's important to find that balance between, as I mentioned, the accuracy and the fine details of how that barrier is performing with a tight, closely spaced grid versus the capabilities of T&M. As we know, if you input too many receptors into T&M or the model gets too complex, it will take a really, really long time to run, and nobody wants to do that. So there is a delicate balance between your grid spacing being too tight or too little, just based on your project. So you can change it, yes.
Excellent. Thank you for that explanation, Christina. We've seen a number of questions that have come in asking where they can find the methodology document. We'll post that link to the chat. That's a web page on the OEM site for all of their documentation. Noise is there, probably about midway through the page. we'll post that link to the chat. Thank you for that question. Next question we have for you, Christina, is there any consideration for development of land beyond its current use? Example, a private golf course that may be converted into a residential development.
Ah, that's a good question. As we do our noise analyses, we are required to look at the land use at the time of the analysis that is permitted. So if it was evaluated as a golf course at the time of the analysis, it will be evaluated as that golf course. And in the future, if it's coordinated to residences, the only way that it would be reevaluated for residences would be if there was a new project that was taking place, because the FDOT does not have a Type 2 retrofit program.
Awesome. Thank you for that explanation. Next question we have here, I believe you touched on this at the very beginning of your presentation. It looks like it's relative to the potential pending changes for the Code of Federal Regulations. And the question is, will the pending changes to 23 CFR Part 772 affect this current methodology?
Yes, there are a few proposed changes to 23 CFR that would indeed directly affect the guidance document. Something anywhere from potentially changing and reorganizing the NAC, which is a simple fix in the methodology document. And there could be more implications to 23 CFR with the proposed changes, but we won't know the full magnitude until the rule is finally published. Once it is published, we will be going through the guidance document and making any applicable changes. The ones that I'm thinking off the top of my head again are the changes to the NAC. And there were changes to potentially how residences are evaluated. And there's a couple of other changes that may influence this methodology. I don't anticipate major overhauls to the methodology, but there will be documentation updates that happen after 23 CFR is made finalized.
Excellent. And it looks like our last question, as of right now, last question we have is, what do I do if I can't find data for the special use site and it's adjacent to the residential area?
We're talking usage information, I assume.
I think that's the intent of the question. Is maybe it's a special use site that, you know, maybe there's a residential area on each side, so you have that you have the residential information, but you don't have anything that you can tie to a BER. Is it appropriate? I'm assuming the questioner is asking, is it appropriate to do a back-end number for the special use site and apply that to a barrier analysis screening with the residences included?
Yes, absolutely. So going back to one of the first questions that was asked about the back-end calculation table, first and foremost, if the residential area qualifies on its own merit and there is a neighboring impacted special land use, if that additional square footage of barrier can accommodate the impacted special land use, perhaps the special land use usage information may not be required. In this case, the weight of the barrier is carried by the residential area. And that back-end calculation table that was previously mentioned, if you fill in the table with the residential data, and the columns, the back-end columns will auto-populate that minimum number of person hour usage and the BER, it'll back calculate that to the minimum number required. So it aids in that back end calculation by providing that minimum number that would be required. And then that number can be compared to the special land use with reasonable assumptions without having that direct data from the property owner, the usage data from the property owner.
Excellent. Thank you. We did have one, it's kind of a question, kind of a comment. It appears that some of the attendees, they like some of your figures for the receptor placement discussed in step 1. There was a recommendation that maybe those type of graphics with aerials with the points on them could be included in maybe the next round of the guidance document whenever that might be updated.
Absolutely. I'm kind of chuckling because we are in the process of updating the document, and we have indeed inserted those graphics into the methodology. I'm glad that others are also supportive of that. That's good to hear.
And that's all the questions that I'm seeing here, Christina. I guess if there are no more questions, I'll turn it back over to you for closing out.
Excellent. If you guys have any additional questions or comment or feedback about this process, please feel free to reach out to Catherine or Neil. Their contact information is found on the screen here. We are welcome to any comments, questions, methods of improving or covering more detailed information in the guidance document, providing more explanations, or, for example, the graphics. If you guys want to see some more of the graphics in the documentation, feel free to speak up and send Catherine or Neil an email. And that's all we have for today. We really appreciate your participation, both in listening to the webinar as well as participating in the Mentimeter quizzes. And we hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Christina.